you begin to sense just before the stall happens, and I think even the most novice, inexperienced pilot, after that has happened, can learn a lot about what those signs are and what it feels like when a glider goes into a stall. So let's talk a little bit about that, because you may have some ideas on it, and certainly if you do, I invite you to share them with us. You could either drop me an email after the show, which is davidj@flytory.com, or you can call in direct. But nonetheless, what happens is when a stall is caused when by the separation of the airflow from the wing's upper surface, and this results usually in a rapid decrease of lift. And when that does happen, there are certain stall characteristics that begin to occur just at the onset of the stall. Oftentimes, there's kind of a gradual increase or onset of these things that occur, and then once they occur, it's bam, it happens quick. But there's a slight, you can oftentimes sense the glider is about to stall, and if we can talk about some of these things that you might sense, it may help you recognize the onset of the stall. I'm about to sneeze, so if you hear me belt one out, you'll give me a gesundheit and I'll go on here. Anyway, it's kind of a difficult thing, because with certain gliders, you're going to feel certain characteristics of a stall maybe more profoundly than on other types of gliders. But just generally speaking, what I sense when you go into a stall situation, the glider starts to feel very, very mushy. And what I mean by that, it all of a sudden starts to feel kind of sluggish when you're real heavy into the brakes. Sometimes the glider will start to shudder just before it goes into a deep stall. Sometimes the wing will start to fall backwards. Not sometimes, almost all the time, if you're doing a dynamic stall or a full stall. Oftentimes you'll hear sounds that sound different with the wing, and a lot of times you'll feel the wind differential as the glider begins to stall. You'll feel the wind either stop or the different direction of the wind suddenly on your face. You begin to feel a rotating backwards of the wing, or of one side of the glider. Use your kinesthetic senses when you're flying, because you have to develop this ability, this cognitive ability to recognize changes in wind and speed. You have to increase your ability to sense these real subtle things just at the beginning of the onset of a stall, because if you don't, you will most definitely find yourself upside down, falling backwards, or in a spin, which means being pendulumed around backwards. And again, we see all of this situation occurring most frequently near the ground when people are making or setting up for landing approaches. So I really, really strongly suggest that as we work on our flying skills, that we not intentionally or inadvertently stall the glider near the ground. And I can tell you that unless you've got at least 100 feet or more, and preferably 300 feet of ground clearance between you and the ground, stalling the glider even from that distance can oftentimes get you in quite a bit of trouble. So imagine when you come in to do your landing approaches, you have to start thinking about that and be very cognizant of that and be very aware of what your wing is giving you in terms of feedback, because if you're not, it's just so obvious that when pilots are stalling their wing, it's because they're just blatantly way deep in the brakes and blatantly non-attentive to what the feedback is that the glider is providing to the pilot. I think just without exception, any glider, before it goes into a stall, a deep stall, or a negative, will provide some feedback. Sometimes it's very subtle, but if you fly with the wing and you train with the wing and you work with the wing, you begin to read the wing much more easily and become aware of what some of these signs and signals are. So pay attention at all times when you're coming in to land. Now, talking about landing, I find that so many of the pilots, when they're coming in and landing, they're oftentimes very, very heavy in the brakes. And again, on landing approaches, speed is your friend. You should be thinking about coming in fast at all times as you near the ground. A couple reasons why I think this is to your advantage as far as safety. First of all, you coming in hot or coming in fast, oftentimes you're flying in turbulent air within 300 feet of the ground. One of the first things you learn about getting close to the ground is you want to get down as quickly as you can and not prolong being in what I call the red zone, which is 300-foot AGL. Anytime you're within 300 foot of the ground, there's a good possibility when you get lower than that, your reserve parachute may not fully deploy. And if you stall the glider or if you have a problem, you don't have much space to work those problems out. So again, when you start getting within 300 foot of the ground, you should be totally attentive, totally aware, and focused on the project of landing. And I say speed is your friend. When you're making landing approaches, you want to come in fast because you want to get down fast. And one of the things that I often suggest is that as you come in to the lower altitude, you often find that you're going to be dealing with more turbulent air. Oftentimes the thermals that are popping off are bigger, are stronger. Oftentimes, hey Murray, how are you?
Not bad, not bad. I thought I'd come in early, give you a bit of support.
Oh, you're awesome, man. Well, we just talked a little bit about landing approaches, so...
yeah, I heard the bit on stalls. That was the bit I was listening to before I muted the volume here.
Right.
One of the things that we do on that, of course, is that the more often you do an incipient stall and recovery, the less likely it is that you will ever actually have an accidental stall.
That's very true.
The trick with that is you find a slope which is slightly steeper than your glide angle, nice grass bank, ideally sort of 30-40 feet in total height. Launch off the top of it, and then once you're out by 10 feet, and you're only up then by a couple of feet, you start easing on the brakes until you're approaching the stall point. You'll then start sinking, and then you ease off the brakes, not let them go, but ease off the brakes to let the wing regain its airspeed. And if you do that half a dozen times a month, you're never likely to have an accidental stall.
That's absolutely great. Of course, one of the reasons why we provide SIV training is that we can send people up over water and get them up a couple of thousand feet above the deck and then have them actually intentionally install the glider, either put it into a full stall, deep stall, or a spin, one side of the wing stalled, and explain to them over the radio as they're falling and going down how to get out of that. Now, once you do that a couple of times, you're right. You begin to sense and feel exactly what happens just prior to the moment of stall, and that oftentimes becomes a real eye-opening experience for many of the people. Yep.
I mean, in 1,500 plus hours of airtime, I have never accidentally stalled a glider, and that's because it's one of the things that I do. I was out at Victoria Park, which is one of my favourite little sites, 35-foot high grass bank, and I can do sort of 360-degree turns. Matter of fact, I can do 720s. And what we do there is with the grass bank, when the conditions are right, you just take the glider onto the stall point, as it starts to mush down, recover it. And every month I probably spend at least an hour, absolute minimum of an hour airtime, just doing that sort of thing. And it means that you never get things coming in biting you. The SIV courses undoubtedly are a great thing, but the big problem with them is you're clear of the ground, so you don't have the extra input which you would normally have in the dangerous situations you were talking about, the low level.
Right.
In other words, you don't have the visual cues when you're high. And also, you have so much more time, you don't necessarily realise just how far you've dropped unless somebody was to film it with another paraglider flying alongside, and they weren't stalling, and then you suddenly see just how quickly you can lose altitude. Whereas that's at low level, you don't have a problem.
That's a very good point, and really in most dramatic stalls, oftentimes a couple hundred feet even is if the glider's not being properly managed, isn't enough to get out of the consequences of the crash or impact.
The same with frontals. I mean, one of the problems can be that if people release too quickly from an actual stall, and particularly not so much quickly, but they release at the wrong point, they can end up getting a major dive forward of the glider and a frontal. And again, if you use the sort of training techniques of using a slope, ideally grass, that's just slightly steeper than your glide angle, and you induce a frontal by surging the wing, then you can really gauge just how best to recover it without losing lots of height. Because the glide angle is just almost matching the slope, you're never going to be doing this more than a couple of feet off the ground, so that when you misjudge it, it's not a problem, and you really drive home the fine-tuning, which you don't get when you're up big and high.
Yeah, and I really do agree with your point that you don't really, when you're up high, oftentimes realize how much you drop and how much altitude you lose on some of these maneuvers.
Yeah.
And oftentimes...
Certainly the typical frontal, I'll lose maybe 10 feet. And if I'm bringing it into a stall, I won't lose more than 15 feet if I'm really demonstrating it to a student. I'll take the glider up and I'll hold it on the stall point so it doesn't go collapsing dynamic. And I'll literally just drop 15, 20, 30, 40 feet, whatever I need to demonstrate the point. And then I'll recover it and continue on flying. And when they're standing on a ridge that's, say, 100 feet high, and you're doing that, and they can see that in a few seconds you can lose 50 of those feet, it brings it home. And that you've got to make them aware of airspeed, as you said, is friendly. You want to keep your speed on. Any turbulence is a smaller percentage. And as you said as well, when you're down low, any thermals, while it might not be bigger, there's certainly higher contrast from the lift and the sink because they're much more cored, much punchier.
Right. Now, some of the things that we spoke about earlier were some of the signs or some of the things that you sense and oftentimes outwardly feel just before the full stall occurs. Do you have anything you could add to that?
Well, the brake pressures change. Now, again, I have a slightly biased view, and I tend to fly higher performance gliders, and I actually don't like and don't feel anything like as safe in DHV1s because they have less feedback. The general rule is that the lower your DHV rating, the more the wing will try and take care of things itself, but the less pilot input you have. Mm-hmm. So again, if you can do this at such a low altitude on a slope that nothing is going to hurt if you get it wrong, the more you practice with your glider, the more in tune you will be with the pressure that's coming back. If you can do that in smooth conditions, you can guarantee 100% that every time it approaches that, you can sense it. Then you gradually build up to slightly tougher conditions, but again in the same situation. And then when you're flying in the real situation, normal flying, you're ahead of the game rather than having to react to something that's unexpected.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's some good points made about how differently each of the gliders will respond based on their rating. And again, some of our people out here listening will oftentimes jump up on a new glider, say they've been flying a 1 or a 1-2, and they jump up into a 2 or 2-3. Again, the handling characteristics oftentimes are quite different, and so you need to really feel the glider out. I always suggest to people, as I'm sure you do, that if you're going to do any of this tricky stuff, do it way above the ground, and if a good place to practice is near the ground, like you're suggesting, is hey, work with it.
You've got to be in 2 safe zones, very, very low or very, very high.
Well, I have watched more than once a guy jump on a new glider, and then on landing, when they start their full flare, just as they're, 5-6 feet off the deck, the wing go negative, and the guy, end up being swung around and landing on his feet, somewhat surprised. So this does happen more than often than not for people that want to, really, really deep stall the glider just on landing approach. Sometimes the glider will go negative on them, but we pick up these signs and so on. We learn, and hopefully we learn without getting banged up. Listen, Murray, we're up for a break. You want to hang on, or you want to call back again, or?
Is it the short one or the long one?
It's the long one. It's the top of the hour.
I'll phone back in 5 minutes.
Okay, big guy.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, thank you much. This is David Jebb, and we're talking with Murray Hayes out of Scotland. We're talking paragliding on World Talk Radio. We're going to be back after this brief intermission, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back.